should be able to see the first slide here, Jacksonian democracy. On the left-hand side of the slide, you actually see a photograph of Andrew Jackson from the 1840s. So a photograph from very early in photography. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, a cartoon of Jackson. It's actually pretty good. Jackson, known for having a very short fuse and also for having gotten several duels during his lifetime. So that's what's going on there. Here you see some cartoons. See, Jackson was a very controversial figure during his time. He is often identified with the beginning of a sort of more democratic polity in the US, more concern with the common man, certainly more inclusion of white working class men in the vote. But on the other hand, Jackson was a catalyst for the formation of a second party system, with his supporters kind of glomming onto him and being one political party, the Democrats, and his antagonists, or the people who hated him, being the other political party, the Whigs. So there are a lot of cartoons that emanated from Jackson's administration because a lot of people didn't agree with his approach or didn't like him. To be fair, Jackson's governing style was very eccentric, very personal to himself. As we're going to see, he really vetoes a lot of legislation. He doesn't really learn from his mistakes. He expands the boundaries of the executive quite a bit. So these are some of the things that we're going to be talking about. Okay. Now, what leads to Andrew Jackson being elected in the first place? We have to go back to the previous administration to understand what happened. The last thing I said to you guys was that on Tuesday, I said, John Quincy Adams emerged as a very skilled, important Secretary of State under James Monroe. When James Monroe finished his terms of office, it was time for an election. This was 1824. And John Quincy Adams, with all of his wonderful diplomatic experience, was running in a multi-presidential candidate election. Jackson was also running, but they were not the only two. Henry Clay of Kentucky, who I have mentioned to you as the great compromiser before, he was the one who came up with the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And William Crawford of Georgia were also running in this race. So it's going to be a multi-candidate race, which always brings up the possibility that there will not be an electoral vote majority that either candidate or that any candidate earns. Making this election of 1824 even a little bit more interesting, the electorate had been expanded greatly by the elimination of property qualifications for the vote. You may be shocked to find out that in the 1800s and 18-teens, not everybody who was a white male over 21 could vote. That there were property qualifications because there was a very sort of old strain of thought going back to 17th century Britain that only a person with a property stake in the country should have the right to decide the country's issues. What this also meant, believe it or not, was that the occasional person of color who did have the right amount of property could vote. But then states changed their property qualifications, enfranchising a vast number of white working class men and excluding the free African Americans from the vote, the few who had a vote up until that point. So it's a much bigger electorate. The electorate voted, and nobody won a majority of the electoral vote. What happens when nobody wins a majority of the electoral vote?
Isn't it the House, the Senate has to vote?
Yeah, the House of Representatives votes based on state, each state gets one vote. So based on state coalition. So here's what happened. Henry Clay went around and said, if you support John Quincy Adams, John Quincy Adams is going to make me Secretary of State in his administration. So there was like a bargain that went on behind the scenes. Henry Clay's supporters in the House of Representatives threw their votes behind John Quincy Adams, and John Quincy Adams was elected. Now, Jackson felt very angry about this. He had had the plurality of the votes. He had the most popular votes. He had had the most electoral votes, although not an electoral vote majority. And so he called this a corrupt bargain. I should have also mentioned that on the state level, massive political parties developed during this time period, that people were encouraged to participate in politics. They were registered to vote. There were parades and barbecues and banners and all kinds of getting people excited about the vote. And as a result of this, voting rates were up in the 70s and 80% of the possible electorate. Now we're lucky if we have like 25% of the people who are registered to vote or could possibly vote coming out to vote. But in the early days of the Republic, this was not the case. So anyway, John Quincy Adams was chosen as president. And Adams' administration was, he was kind of federalist minded. He didn't do a lot of outreach to the common person, but he did want major government expenditure on things like museums and universities and roads and bridges. He had a Hamiltonian vision of what was best for the country, so we build infrastructure, we encourage industry, that sort of thing. But then when it came time for him to run for re-election, Adams was a very old-fashioned guy, and he didn't think that he should actually have to put himself out there and appeal to the electorate. Back in the days of Washington as president, Washington was chosen because he seemed like the natural man for the job. And Adams really thought that he could stand upon his achievements in his first term, but he was really quite out of step with the rest of the people, especially this new electorate. So that brings us to the election of 1828. Now, the election of 1828 was particularly acrimonious. It was particularly dirty, mudslingy. Jackson accused John Quincy Adams of being an aristocrat who was out of touch with the people, of being a pimp. Where am I getting the pimp thing from? Where was Jackson getting it from? Well, as a young man, John Quincy Adams had been an ambassador, like intern, at the court of the czars in Russia. And when people came to the czar's court, when Americans came there to be introduced and entertained, he would find beautiful women for them to be escorted by, or to escort. So it wasn't far from there to John Quincy Adams as a pimp. In return, Adams accused Jackson of being a murderer, which he had killed somebody in a duel, an adulterer, which I'll explain in a second, and an illiterate yokel. And to be perfectly honest, his writing skills were not the best. So he was not great at literacy, but it's not a thing that you want to tag somebody with while trying to appeal to a large electorate of people who are also kind of negligibly educated. So Anyway, in terms of Jackson's quote-unquote adultery, here's what happened. Jackson's wife, Rachel Robards Jackson, had been married before. She broke up with her husband, and to the best of her knowledge, a divorce had gone through that was finalized. But then they found out after they had been married for some time that the divorce papers had never actually been processed. So she was married to Jackson, but she was also married to Robards, her previous husband. The allegations of adultery in connection with this stressed out Rachel Robards Jackson so much that she had a heart attack and died before Jackson was actually inaugurated in 1829, and Jackson was just a simmering mass of hatred. Okay, so the election of 1828 was kind of a landslide election. Jackson was easily elected, and this was seen as a victory for the common man. Jackson presented himself as a tribune of the common man, despite the fact that he was a lawyer, a wealthy landowner, and had a bunch of slaves. Nonetheless, through his sort of folksy personality and his military exploits, he was able to really appeal to the populace. His inauguration was kind of a zoo. People came to the White House in droves from all over the country, and they kind of stomped all over the place. They went in and out of the windows. There was a giant cheese that Wisconsin Territory had sent, and people were rolling this big round cheese around on the White House lawn. And people who were not Jackson supporters were like appalled. They said, "What have we done? We've elected a crazy man." Questions so far?
That happened on the White House grounds before then, like a big gathering for the burning?
No, for the inauguration before, there had never been this kind of crowd. People didn't feel as though they were invited to come to the White House. Jackson even was a little bit afraid of what he had wrought, because he ended up going out of a window. He was almost crushed by the crowd and had to escape through a window. So, questions from people on Zoom?
I think it's funny that they were rolling cheese around on the lawn.
I do too. It's also funny that it's Wisconsin, so. All right, so Jackson comes into office, and here's what happens. His governing style was different from anything anybody had seen before. It was very personal. He decided, in totally not paying attention to earlier precedent, to get rid of everybody in the government who was at any level, any high level position, and replace them with his own hand-picked successors. His comment was, "To the victors belong the spoils." So anybody who held a position of ambassador or headed a government department, any of that stuff, those people were all replaced with major donors or major supporters of Jackson. This has now become more or less a regular practice, but Jackson was the first one to do it. Another thing that he did that people objected to was to appoint his own advisors who were not part of his actual cabinet. Now, when Jackson was elected, John C. Calhoun was his vice president. But Jackson and Calhoun really didn't get along, so Calhoun was not included in the day-to-day discussions of policy. And the problem with having the sort of kitchen cabinet or his best friends around him as advisors is there wasn't a good way for them to be removed or for their influence to be opposed. Another thing that Jackson did in his governing style was to really antagonize the wives of Washington, D.C. So Washington wives were extremely important in sort of greasing the wheels of sociability in the 1820s. They were the ones who held dinners where The husbands, came and talked politics. They were the ones who entertained visiting dignitaries. And Jackson insisted that the wife of his Secretary of War, John Eaton, a woman named Peggy Eaton, that the Washington wives invite her to all the social stuff. They really didn't want to, because Peggy Eaton was kind of a notorious woman. There were all sorts of rumors about her, that she had had an affair, that a lover of hers had committed suicide when she rejected him. But Jackson was super, insistent. Why do you suppose Jackson was such a big proponent of Peggy Eaton?
He had just lost his wife.
That's exactly it, yes. He had just lost his wife to similar allegations, that stressed her out and caused her to die. And so he was trying to force his cabinet to obey. Some of his cabinet members actually resigned over the Peggy Eaton affair, so it was not just like a little small thing. And then finally, he used the veto power more than any other president up until that time. He was not afraid to kind of undo the work of Congress with the veto. And he was especially objecting to things like infrastructure that spanned more than one state, because he thought every state had the responsibility for its own infrastructure, and he didn't want to get into the precedent of the federal government paying for things like that. Okay, so in 1828, right before Jackson came into office, a very high tariff had been passed and signed into law. This was a tariff that Southerners called the Tariff of Abominations. Now, just to emphasize to you, tariffs in this time period were bad for farmers because they bought things from abroad, and those things that they were buying, like farm implements and cloth and hemp and whatever, all of that was marked up, was more expensive. And moreover, when they tried to sell their farm produce abroad, there were retaliatory tariffs put on by other countries. The whole purpose of a tariff in this period was to protect American industries as they were growing. So it really did sort of pit industrialists, factory masters, those kinds of people against farmers. Well, one of the people who was the most pissed off about the Tariff of Abominations was John C. Calhoun. Calhoun, the vice president. Why? Well, Calhoun was from South Carolina. South Carolina had fallen on some economic hard times. They were dependent on slavery. They feared for the future of slavery. The South Carolinians actually started to discuss the doctrine of nullification. The doctrine of nullification is important, and this is the second time I'm mentioning it in this class. The doctrine of nullification is the idea that states have a right to nullify legislation that they consider abhorrent for whatever reason. They have the right to nullify federal legislation. That's the claim. In a work called The Exposition and Protest, John Calhoun had defended the doctrine of nullification. And then there was a lot of conflict between Calhoun and Jackson in public. At the annual Jefferson Day dinner in 1830, Jackson challenged Calhoun by lifting up his drink and saying, "The Union, it must be preserved," kind of accusing Calhoun of wanting to split the Union over the question of the tariff. Calhoun gave a toast right back: "The Union next to our liberty the most dear. May we all remember that it can only be preserved by respecting the rights of the states and distributing equally the benefit and burden of the Union." Okay, so the two of them didn't like each other. There was another tariff in 1832 that continued the high level of the tariff. And South Carolina at this point reacted by nullifying the tariff. So the legislature of South Carolina said, we're not going to pay this tariff. We're going to get a militia together and we're planning on seceding from the Union. Jackson was like, okay, fine, Congress, pass a bill for me to send troops down there to collect the tariff by force. So that was the 1833 force bill. And it could very well have come to an attempt at secession or a civil war, were it not for the fact that Henry Clay drafted a Compromise Tariff Act, which lowered the tariff over a series of years, and then Jackson didn't have to send troops into South Carolina, and the question of secession was put off for the time being. Any questions?
How did Calhoun get elected as vice president?
The way that vice presidents worked by this point is they were on a ticket. So I suppose the point was to balance the ticket by choosing Calhoun, even though he was not at all Jackson's favorite person. You also can't have two, a president and a vice president from the same state. So
When would a president start picking their own vice president?
after the 12th Amendment was passed.
Okay.
So after Jefferson's administration. Okay. So what is Jackson known for besides the nullification crisis? Well, Jackson, one of the things he's best known for is the removal of Native Americans from the east side of the country to west of the Mississippi. There were lots of tribes in the Southeast especially, part of a group called the Five Civilized Tribes. And these tribes, the Cherokees, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, the Creeks, and the Seminoles, had assimilated the most to Anglo society, out of all the tribes that there were at this point. For example, I'm going to concentrate now on the Cherokees. The Cherokees had farms, they had businesses. There were 1,600 African-American enslaved people who were owned by the Cherokees to work their plantations. Many of the Cherokees had intermarried with Anglos. They produced a kind of mixed heritage group that exercised leadership. Many of them could read and write English. They had been educated by Christian missionaries. They had their own alphabet. They published their own newspaper. And they had a constitution which was patterned after the US Constitution. So when we're looking at the Cherokees in particular, and by inference, the other quote unquote civilized tribes, these were people who were quite assimilated. Well, Jackson decided to remove the Native Americans from the Southeast under pressure from southern states that wanted to use the land for Anglo settlement. Cherokee lands in particular were attractive because there was gold that had been found, but also just, white farmers wanted to move somewhere to the west. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 approved funds for the relocation of Native American tribes. So $500,000 was set aside, and then treaties were signed with over 100 tribes to move them west of the Mississippi. This was a process of coercion. The US government would find whoever it was that they could find within a tribe, say, oh, okay, this person's the chief, even if they weren't, and then have them sign the treaty, and then everybody would have to move. Jackson said that the reason for this was to insulate Native Americans from the pressure of having to assimilate so they could maintain their culture free from Anglo domination. But, you know, that's ridiculous because, as I just said a moment ago, they were pretty assimilated already. The Cherokees really wanted to assert their own autonomy. They were told that they didn't have control over things like the legal system within their own tribal boundaries because their tribal boundaries were within the state of Georgia. So there were a couple of Supreme Court cases, Cherokee versus Georgia and Worcester versus Georgia, where the state of Georgia had made laws saying, for example, that Christian missionaries couldn't stay on the Cherokee reservation or the Cherokee lands. The Cherokees wanted them to stay. This went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided in favor of the Cherokees. What they said about the Cherokees and other Indian tribes was that they were, quote unquote, domestic dependent nations. That is, they're nations, they're still nations. They are domestic because they're within US borders. But they still get autonomy to be able to make these kinds of decisions. At this point, the Supreme Court was still chaired by John Marshall, the Chief Justice for a really long time. And supposedly Jackson's reaction was, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. So that was a problem. He didn't feel like he was bound by the Supreme Court decision. This is going to set up a situation where the Cherokees were forced to walk hundreds of miles from their lands in Tennessee and Georgia to what is now Oklahoma and was at that point, quote unquote, Indian territory. It was a terrible event in Native American history called the Trail of Tears. And I will be talking more about that momentarily. Okay. Another thing that Jackson was really well known for was crashing the economy. Here's how that happened. The Second Bank of the United States, as I said to you the other day, was part of the American system. It was part of this post-War of 1812 attempt to build up American infrastructure and credit and, you know, really make the United States a thriving kind of Hamiltonian place. The Second Bank of the United States was run by a man named Nicholas Biddle, who Jackson absolutely hated. He could not have been any more the polar opposite of Jackson. He was wealthy and cultured and thought Jackson was an illiterate yokel. So he really looked down on Jackson, but that was not the main reason for the opposition to the Bank of the US. The bank was held by private shareholders. About 1/8 of the shareholders were foreign, so a lot of the profit of the bank is being reaped by foreign interests, mostly British. Jackson hated the British ever since during the Revolutionary War. He had gotten into a sort of tussle with a British officer who had slashed him across the face with a saber, and so that's why Jackson always had a big scar. So ever since then, Jackson hated the British. But moreover, the Bank of the US was this weird money-making machine that Jackson thought was harming the people. He didn't believe in paper money. The bank was issuing paper money. He thought it was a swindle. He thought that individual, farmers and modest people were being kind of swindled out of their life savings. So, Nicholas Biddle decided to apply for an early recharter of the Second Bank of the US. The charter was supposed to run out in 1836, which was going to be at the end of Jackson's term. However, Biddle was feeling quite confident since, Congress liked the bank. so he thought he'd apply for an early recharter. And Jackson vetoed the recharter bill. So now the bank is not going to be rechartered, and it's only going to be around for another couple years. Well, the response to this by Nicholas Biddle was to call in all the loans that the bank had extended to state banks and to individual industrialists. When somebody calls in a loan, it's like you suddenly have to pay everything you owe on the principal right away. And people didn't have that money. So there was a huge contraction of the economy as less money was in circulation. Jackson took the reserves from the Bank of the US and put it in his, what were called pet banks. These were state banks run by people who he trusted. And this whole situation is known as the bank war. Depression loomed. People started blaming this economic depression on Jackson. Jackson tried to head off depression by restricting the use of paper money. So the specie circular was issued, which said government would only accept payment in hard currency, that is, gold and silver. And that contracted the money supply even more, because you don't want to hold money that isn't good for anything. The Panic of 1837 was a 5-year economic depression that left about a third of the waged workforce jobless. This was a time when there wasn't any social safety net. Thankfully, a lot of people were farmers who were still, growing crops for their own family support. But the people who were not doing that really suffered. Okay. Questions so far?
Where did his hatred for paper money come from? Like, online banking isn't a thing, so like that can't be possible.
Yeah, he kind of felt as though paper money could be manipulated, that there was a way in which the issuer of paper money benefited from issuing paper money. And there is something behind that, because if paper money, if money's cheap, then it's easy for debtors to pay back loans. If money's expensive, it's harder. And he was also really afraid of aggravations of power and saw the Bank of the United States as this terrible accretion of power that couldn't be trusted. But a lot of the fears about paper money were kind of crackpot. So it's kind of hard to come up with a good explanation for what Jackson was thinking. Okay. In 1836, at the end of Jackson's administration, Native Americans, the Cherokees, were forced to travel that distance, as I said, between Tennessee and Georgia on the one hand and Oklahoma on the other. As a result of this, out of the 16,000 people who embarked on the Trail of Tears, it's estimated about 4,000 of them died along the way. In case you're wondering, well, what happened? They didn't have, the US government farmed out to the lowest bidder the supply and logistics of moving people along the Trail of Tears, and so there weren't enough carts or wagons for people to ride, so they had to walk. There wasn't anything to be done for sick people. They didn't have medicine available. They didn't have food and water available at a lot of places, and people were being moved at the point of a bayonet. So the Cherokees went on the Trail of Tears. They were forced to create a new society in Oklahoma, and all of that land that had belonged to them was now opened up for Anglo settlement. Questions? I don't want to skip over the next president, so I'll say a few things about him. Martin Van Buren was Jackson's handpicked successor. He served from 1837 to 1841. He had won quite easily. A couple things that happened during his administration. There was a conflict that he inherited from the Jackson administration called the Seminole War. This was a war against the Seminole tribe of Native Americans in Florida. It cost the government between $40 and $60 million to fight, and stretched out until the early 1840s. There was also an undeclared war on the northern border of Maine. So Mainers and the residents of New Brunswick in what was then British-controlled Canadian province were fighting against each other. If you've ever seen the movie Amistad, about the 1841 trial of a group of enslaved people who had mutinied against their ship captains, that occurred during Van Buren's administration. Anyway, that brings us up to the election of 1840. And what's important about this is that things had crystallized at this point into two groups. People who supported Andrew Jackson and thought that he had done a good job, and people who hated everything that Jackson stood for. The second party system involved the anti-Jackson forces identifying themselves as Whigs. The Whigs were Protestant. A lot of the Whigs were anti-slavery. So what this means is they contended for the equality of people across racial lines, but they tended to be really xenophobic. They did not like immigrants. They especially didn't like Catholic immigrants. Whigs had a tendency to be wealthy and to be reformist in the sense that they wanted to get rid of Sunday mail delivery. They wanted to specify religious education in the schools. They wanted to not have Sunday shopping. They wanted to prohibit alcohol, some of them.
Is that just to have church all Sunday instead of having mail and shopping?
Yeah. They, basically there used to be what were called blue laws all over the US where you couldn't shop on Sundays, and there still isn't mail delivery on Sundays. So, no, that's all a heritage of the Whigs. The Democrats, in contrast, Jackson's political party, were often pro-slavery. So they believed that there was white supremacy, but they tended to embrace all white people. So they were pro-immigrant. The Democratic Party was the more pro-Irish immigration party. They were anti-reform. They didn't want things like abolition of slavery or the abolition of drinking. They tended to be more states' rights and more farm-based. And they were more Jeffersonian. So if we have to follow the sort of Hamiltonian-Jeffersonian split, we put the Whigs with the party of Hamilton and the Democrats with the party of Jefferson. Now, we've come a long way since John Quincy Adams. By the election of 1840, both sides understood what they were dealing with. They were dealing with an electorate that needed to be appealed to on their own level. So they had songs, they had mottos. Martin Van Buren adopted the nickname Old Kinderhook because he was from Kinderhook, New York. This got shortened to OK. So the OK, the phrase OK or the word OK comes from Martin Van Buren's campaign. The Whigs came up with their own anti-Martin Van Buren slogan, Van is a used up man. And they put their candidate, William Henry Harrison, they identified him with two things that were supposed to be really appealing to the people: log cabins and hard cider. Lots of people lived in log cabins in this period and drank hard cider. And even though William Henry Harrison was not exactly a man of the people, that's what they made him out to be. So they used democratic tactics and really won on the basis of those. The slogan or motto for the Whigs was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And that's very catchy. Now here's the weird thing. Harrison died soon after coming to office. He died after only like 3 months. People say maybe he died because he stood out in the cold weather too long when it was his inauguration and he caught some kind of cold or pneumonia or something. Other people say, well, he got cholera from eating cherries that had been washed in poopy water. Whatever, he died. His vice president, John Tyler, ended up being a better Democrat than a Whig. In terms of his policies, he really sympathized with the Democrats. So the Whigs triumphed in 1840, but I would say that they kind of lost the war as far as that goes. Yeah, here in my notes, I have 78% of the electorate voted in 1840. Can you imagine?
You were saying like 20% now of registered voters.
Yeah. By the way, the election is in 19 days, so everyone make sure that you vote for your candidate of choice, whoever that is. Okay.
So how do they even go off of elections if 20% of the registered voters even vote?
Well, because voting is voluntary in this country, that's sort of the only way the only choice people have. I think a more effective way of running voting is how it works in Australia. In Australia, voting is mandatory. So everyone goes to the polls. Voting is held on a Saturday. There are a bazillion polling locations, not like here. There's no voter registration. You just turn up, you're already sort of in the system.
Show your ID.
Yeah, so you vote. The PTA, because voting is normally at schools, has like a barbecue, so people hang out and socialize with each other, and they really have like almost 100% voting, which in terms of if you're trying to find out if it's the will of the people, that's certainly a better way than having 20% turnout. Oh, thank you for posting the Doña Ana County voting info. I will tell you also that there's going to be voting at Corbett starting Monday. So there's usually not a line. If you are registered to vote in New Mexico, that's a